Welcome to the National Electrical and Communications Association and the Fair Work Ombudsman's electronic seminar for the Electrical, Electronic and Communications Contracting Industry Award 2010. My name is Oliver Judd. I'm the Employee Relations Manager for NECA, and I will also be your Fair Work Liaison Officer. If you have any questions in relation to this video, feel free to contact me on the details that will be provided later on to discuss any of the issues you may have. Please note that this video is supplemented by a guide to the modern award and the National Employment Standards. We recommend that you have a copy available with you during the video to assist you to understand the scenarios that are dealt with. To obtain a copy, simply fill your details into the form on this page and NECA will get a copy to you. This presentation is broken into chapters, each containing an explanation of each of the National Employment Standards, or NES, and an explanation of the more critical provisions of the Electrical, Electronic and Communications Contracting Award 2010. It is important that you understand the obligations outlined in this video, as there are significant fines that can be imposed where businesses do not comply. This chapter deals with all-purpose allowances, special allowances work-related and special allowances expense-related. Each is outlined and described at page 3 of the guide. The industry allowance is calculated at 3.7% of the standard weekly rate per week and is paid to compensate employees for the following disabilities associated with on-site work. 1. Climatic conditions when working in the open on all types of work. 2. The physical disadvantage of having to climb stairs or ladders. 3. The disability of dust and fumes blowing in the wind, brick dust and drippings from newly poured concrete. 4. Sloppy and muddy conditions associated with the initial stages of on-site construction work. 5. The disability of working on all types of scaffolding, excluding swing scaffolding, and/or the lack of usual permanent amenities associated with factory work. Tool allowance. Employees that are working at grade 5 or above, or employed as apprentices, are entitled to a weekly tool allowance. Electrical workers performing the duties of television antenna installers, erectors, or television, radio, electronic equipment service persons are also entitled to this allowance. Electricians' license allowance. An electrical worker who is an electrical mechanic and is required to use an unrestricted license must be paid an all-purpose allowance of 3.6% of the weekly standard rate of pay. Leading hand allowance. An employee specifically appointed to be a leading hand must be paid the percentage of the standard weekly rate per week identified at page 4 of the guide, in addition to the all-purpose hourly rate of pay for the highest classification supervised, or their own rate, whichever is the highest, in accordance with the number of employees in their charge. Rate for ordering materials. This allowance is paid to employees engaged in the building and construction industry at the rate of 2% of the weekly standard rate per week, and must be paid when an employee is left in charge of a job which is of a duration of 1 week or more, and is required to order materials for a job on which 2 employees, including the person receiving the extra payment, are engaged. This amount will only be paid when 4 or more days in a pay period are spent on such duties. For periods shorter than 4 days, a minimum payment of 0.4% of the weekly standard rate per day will be paid. This allowance is not payable to an employee receiving any of the leading hand allowances. Nominee allowance. An electrical mechanic who holds the relevant state electrical license and acts as a nominee for an electrical contractor must be paid an additional all-purpose allowance of at least 9.2% of the weekly standard rate per week. Where a business operates so that it is reliant upon the license of an employee to maintain a contractor's license, such an employee will be considered the nominee of the business and will be entitled to the allowance identified. Electrical distribution line maintenance and tree clearing allowance. An allowance of 7.7% of the weekly standard rate per week must be paid to employees engaged on tree clearing and work associated with the maintenance of electrical distribution lines. Application of special allowances, expense related. Special allowances are not cumulative. Where more than one of the disabilities which entitles an employee to the payment of a special allowance occurs, the employer will be bound to pay only one rate, being the highest rate for the applicable disability. The special allowances will be paid irrespective of the times at which the work is performed and will not be subject to any premium or penalty additions. Meal allowance. An employee required to work overtime for 2 or more hours without being notified on the previous day or earlier must either be supplied with a meal by the employer or be paid an allowance for the first meal and for each subsequent meal. Such payment need not be made to employees living in the same locality where work is being conducted and who can reasonably return home for meals. The meal allowance is currently $12.81 per meal. Unless an employer advises an employee on the previous day or earlier that the amount of overtime to be worked will necessitate the partaking of a second or subsequent meal, the employer must provide such second or subsequent meals or make payment instead thereof as prescribed. If an employee has provided a meal or meals as a result of a request by an employer to stay back and work overtime, and is not required to work the overtime, or is required to work less than the amount of time advised, the employee must be paid for meals which the employee has provided but which are surplus. First aid allowance. An employee who has been trained to render first aid and who is the current holder of an appropriate first aid qualification, such as a certificate from the St. John Ambulance or similar body, must be paid a weekly allowance of 2.1% of the weekly standard rate if the employee is appointed by the employer to perform first aid duty. Compensation or loss of tools. An employer must compensate an employee for the payment of an allowance to replace tools lost by breaking and entering while securely stored at the employer's direction in a room or building on the employer's premises, job, workshop, or in a lockup, provided that this clause will not apply if the employer has requested the employee to supply the employer with a list of tools required to be kept on the job and the employee has not supplied such a list. Fare and travel allowances. Due to the complexity of the fare and travel allowances, this matter will be addressed shortly in its own section, but it is an expense-related special allowance. Application of special allowances, work-related. Multi-Storey allowance. A multi-storey allowance must be paid to all on-site employees engaged in the construction of a multi-storey building to compensate for the disabilities experienced in and which are peculiar to the construction of a multi-storey building. The scale of percentages to be applied to the standard weekly rate is identified at page 6 of the guide. A multi-storey building is a building which will, when complete, consist of 5 or more storey levels. The second and subsequent allowance scales will, where applicable, commence to apply to all employees when one of the following components of the building: structural steel, reinforcing steel, boxing, or walls, rises above the floor level first designated in each such allowance scale. Floor level means that stage of construction which in the completed building would constitute the walking surface of the particular floor level referred to in the table of payments. The allowance payable at the highest point of the building will continue until completion of the building. Service corps. All employees employed on a service corps at more than 15 metres above the highest point of the main structure must be paid the multi-storey rate appropriate for the main structure calculated from the highest point reached by the main structure to the highest point reached by the service corps in any one-day period. Employees employed on a service corps no higher than 15 metres above the main structure must be paid in accordance with the multi-storey allowance prescribed herein, provided that any section of a service corps exceeding 15 metres above the highest point of the main structure will be disregarded for the purpose of calculating the multi-storey allowance applicable to the main structure. Tower allowance. An employee working on a chimney stack, spire, tower radio or television mast or tower, air shaft, other than above ground in a multi-storey building, lift shaft, service shaft, cooling tower or silo, where the construction exceeds 15 metres in height, will be paid for all work above 15 metres an allowance of 3.2% of the hourly standard rate per hour, and for work above each further 15 metres an additional allowance of 3.2% of the hourly standard rate per hour. Availability for duty allowance. This allowance is similar to what has traditionally been known as an on-call allowance. Employees are entitled to be paid the allowance where they are required to be available for the business for call-out work, i.e., where the employee has returned home and needs to remain available to the employer to attend work should a need arise. This weekly allowance is payable regardless of how many hours the employee is available for duty within the weekly pay cycle. The availability allowance is currently $58.40 per week. In order to qualify for the payment, the employee must be contactable by telephone at any time while the employee is receiving the allowance. In addition to the allowance, where the employee is called out to attend work, the employer is entitled to be paid from the moment the employee leaves the door of their home to the moment they return to the door of their home, i.e., door to door. The employee must be paid for a minimum of 2 hours at the appropriate rate. The appropriate rate of pay will depend on when the call-out occurs. On a Sunday, the rate will be double time. On a public holiday, the rate will be double time and 1/2. During the week, the rate will be time and a half for the first 2 hours and double time thereafter. Employers must note that, in relation to all allowances discussed as part of this presentation, where they are described as a percentage, it is to be calculated on the base rate of an electrical worker grade 5. Thank you for watching this video. We encourage you to watch all the chapters in this series. If you have any questions, you can contact me on the details that are shown, and if you haven't already obtained a copy of the guide, we strongly recommend that you get one as soon as possible.